Okay. I said we were going to talk about the three primary documents that are part of America's founding. The Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, and the Constitution of the United States. We may have to wind up breaking this up into two different lectures, which that'll be fun. Okay? But right after Lexington and Concord, right after the founders started the Second Continental Congress, we had a problem. We had declared war, and so now we needed to be busy about attempting to negotiate peace. There was still a faction who held out that we can make this thing end peacefully. We don't have to shoot and kill each other anymore. John Dickinson is one of these individuals who was from the Middle Colonies, who really stressed the idea that we need to find a way to resolve this peacefully. Okay? Most of the Middle Colonies are merchants dependent upon English trade. In July 1775, they send the Olive Branch Petition to England. John Dickinson writes this document up in order to try to get the king to intervene personally. Okay? The document affirms our loyalty to the king. We affirm that we are good, loyal British subjects who have been abused, oppressed by the king's ministers and by the parliament. Dickinson tries to throw blame off on the king's ministers and the parliament in order to try to get the king to come in on our side. Because the only way we're going to make this thing go away at this point is for the king to come in and say, this ends now. And that would have been the only way it would have ended. So, July 1775, we ship this letter off to England in an attempt to gain a peace treaty from this from the shooting that's already started. The document makes a recommendation that we can avoid all of these no taxation without representation issues if each of the American assemblies are considered small parliaments. And so that way the taxation amongst the colonists can come from the king to the local assemblies, then to the people. Okay? This was one of the recommendations, one of the compromises that was attempted to get everything worked out. King George, however, rejects it out of hand. He doesn't even bother to give it the dignity of reading it. He believes that the people in the colonies are, number one, a small minority, and number two, they are rebels, traitors, and enemies of the crown and enemies of England. And so at this point, King George has resolved to fight a war. Okay, so after the Olive Branch Petition is sent, John Dickinson gets placed on a committee with Thomas Jefferson, and they are supposed to create a draft of the American for the Declaration of Independence, because we've already been in consultations with France, and we've discovered that they have those two agenda items. They need to have a guarantee that we're going to break with England. We're not just going to all of a sudden make nice in the middle of this war, and they need to see that we can defend ourselves. So, January 1776, there is a big push in Philadelphia for independence. Thomas Paine, a failed corset salesman from England, comes to Pennsylvania. He meets Franklin in England. Franklin looks at some of his writings, and Franklin tells him he should come to the New World and start writing for the Pennsylvania Magazine. And so he does. While he's there, he meets the delegates from the Second Continental Congress, and he is enthralled with this concept of a Declaration of Independence, becoming an independent nation. He writes a pamphlet while here called Common Sense. Some of you should, all of you should read it. Common sense is simple language. Most of the stuff that's been written up to this point has been very, very esoteric. It's been very high-level education, political philosophy. But Thomas Paine is a newspaper man. He writes in plain language for the common man. It's at this point that many people believe that the cause of independence becomes very much a common person discussion, more than just an elitist intellectual discussion. Okay, he does make some strong arguments for independence. However, in that being said, he does make some very, very weak arguments for independence. But it's a whole series of arguments. They will be published. His arguments point to the king as a tyrant rather than to the parliament, so it takes a whole different tact than the olive branch petition. And in the first year, over 150,000 copies of this pamphlet are sold up and down the colonies. They are copied in newspaper. They are read aloud from pulpits and town meetings. Thomas Paine's text of the causes for independence, he says it's just common sense for us to govern ourselves. Now, this is sort of this method that we turn independence into the common cause. Two events are going to help push the colonists towards independence, because at this point there are many who still do not want independence. The first is that notion of the possible alliance with the French. The French have been providing us with military supplies, okay, but they will grant us a naval power, plus, but they have to have firm assurances that we will separate. So therefore, we need a declaration of independence. The French aren't going to join in a war with us and have us in the middle of the conflict make nice with England and go back to being England, because at that point France is still at war with England. So they have to have some assurances that we are going to separate. The second issue that becomes very important for the colonists in deciding whether or not to declare independence is the British start negotiating with the Germans for mercenary troops. These are usually called the Hessians. These mercenaries make their money by pillaging the battlefields. Whenever they've killed soldiers, whatever they have in their pockets, whatever equipment they have, these Germans are allowed to scavenge the battlefield and sell the equipment to the British army. The British soldiers are executed if they are caught plundering the battlefield. But these mercenaries, this is how they're paid. So they capture all the weapons and they sell the weapons to the British, and then the money is divvied up amongst the German troops. And the thing of it is, when the Germans come at you, when you've been shot in battle, if you're wounded, as far as the German's concerned, everything you have is his. And if you're still alive, well, it's much easier to get your grandfather's gold watch out of your pocket if you're not alive. And so you're going to be killed. The Germans don't take any prisoners because prisoners carry stuff away. And so the Germans are fairly ruthless. Fairly ruthless. And so by May, all but 4 of the colonies have now, because of these events, decided they want a Declaration of Independence. Pennsylvania, Maryland, New York, and South Carolina. These last 2 states are the ones with the large loyalist communities. And so they're going to be some of the more difficult to get in line as far as the revolution is concerned. So in June 1776, Virginia introduces a resolution for independence. The vote gets postponed because we want to make sure that all the colonies are on board. And so all of these people are sent back home to make sure from their state legislatures that they're ready to commit to this cause. because we can't have just 2 or 3 colonies attempting to gain independence when the rest of the colonies are still part of England. Jefferson and Dickinson and a few others are appointed to a committee to start producing a rough draft of a Declaration of Independence. When they come back the next month in July, the first vote is taken. Pennsylvania and South Carolina both vote no as far as whether or not they're going to declare independence. And the state of Delaware only sent 2 delegates. And so they were split, so effectively they were a no. And New York abstains. The delegates from New York don't even vote. Okay, it was a big Tory stronghold. I think they were holding out just to see who would, what would happen. So, a lot of the political discussion and everything takes place. The next day they have another vote. Pennsylvania and South Carolina have changed their vote to yes on independence. And a third delegate arrives from Delaware to change Delaware's vote 2-1, making Delaware agree to independence, and then New York abstains again. New York doesn't vote. However, what we have here is the resolution to declare ourselves independent passes with no votes. It's not unanimous, but there are no votes as far as independence is concerned. And so this is sort of a big deal. Now, the Declaration itself. You've already read it. The second and the third, they debate the document. The document, a preamble of philosophical principles of natural rights, equality, right to revolution, the consent of the governed as the only true basis of government. And then it lists 24 grievances specifically pointed at the king. Okay? The colonists blaze right through it. They blaze right through it. Except Georgia and South Carolina had problem with the with part of the first draft. Jefferson had blamed the king for the institution of slavery. I believe he said something to the effect of, he has caused that damnable institution that degrades the human condition, blah, 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 a whole bunch of things like that, blaming the King of England for allowing slavery to come to the colonies. The delegations from Georgia and South Carolina aren't going to sign it if this part of, if this grievance against the king is left in there. They believe it would endangers their institution of slavery. And contrary to a lot of people's beliefs, it was Thomas Jefferson who was trying to bring an end to slavery in the colonies, or in the early United States. Even though he is on record as being a slaveholder, Jefferson in his other writings indicates that if there were a way that they could do it, he would want to eliminate the institution of slavery. So they do drop the slavery issue. Benjamin Franklin and John Adams convinced Jefferson to not be so stubborn and drop this issue. The second thing that they do keep in the Declaration, which actually turns out not to have been true, Jefferson blames the King of England for involving the Indians in the fight. Matter of fact, it was the Crown who kept trying to get the Indians not to involve themselves into the fight. They tried to couch it in language that they would understand. You need to understand this is a fight between brothers. Eventually, brothers come back together, and if you choose a side in this fight between brothers, when the fight is over, you will have made yourself the enemy of one of the brothers. And so England tries to keep the Indians out of the American Revolution, at least in the beginning, until it appears that there's not going to be a quick resolution made. July 4th, Jefferson's final text is adopted, and then in August the 2nd, the handwritten calligraphied copy is signed by everyone. 4 men refused to sign the Declaration. One of them was one of the authors, John Dickinson. At this point, John Dickinson believed that there still must be a chance. There still must be a way to bring this to peaceful resolution. But alas, there wasn't. July 15th, before the signature, New York switched from abstaining to endorsement. And so at that point, after July 15th, the Declaration of Independence enjoys unanimous consent. Printed copies do not have the signatures on it, because basically to sign it would be basically signing your treason confession. Hancock and Franklin, as they are coming together to sign it, Hancock signs and hands the pen to Franklin and says, "Come, we must all hang together now." And Ben Franklin, according to tradition, makes his eloquent statement, "True, or we will all hang separately if we don't all hang together." So that's the case for independence. The reason that we needed to declare independence as quickly as we did was because we needed the allies of the French. We needed the French helping us. And so now, once we've declared independence in 1776, now we have to come together to create a government. The problem is, this Continental Congress came together under emergency conditions. We talked about those first 4 meetings. Okay? After independence was declared, we laid out very specific ideas about what a legitimate government looked like, and what their role was. So now these guys who declared independence are looking around, and they don't look like what they said legitimate government looks like. So they decided that they need to put together a form of government that fulfills the principles dictated in the Declaration of Independence. They need to make a government that looks like what they said legitimate government looks like. Okay? And they needed a document to lay out Congress's powers and, more importantly, its limits. Okay? Dickinson would be placed in charge of the of this committee, right? Dickinson, the Articles of Confederation, are predominantly his work, like the Declaration of Independence is predominantly Jefferson's work. The first draft, this new central government will have the power to make war and peace, to conduct foreign relations, to regulate trade for all of these states. It would provide a postal service so that communication can take place up and down the colonies. It would have the ability to issue bills of credit and to borrow money, because we need to equip soldiers, we need to build ships and things like that. It would have the power to settle land disputes between the states, especially over state boundaries and things like that. It would also administer all the western lands that were yet to be settled. Now, these last two are the big problem, because the states don't want a central government that has the power to arbitrate over them, nor does it want them to be able to take their western lands away from them. They want to make sure that they hang on to all that. So the first draft of the Articles of Federation is sort of brushed away. Some states had lots of land, other states had almost no land. Now, the final draft, which was completed November 1777, its main concern is the war. We've got to administer the war and make sure the colonial army is supplied. Okay? Changes from this first draft. They're going to identify the union of these states as a loose confederation of sovereign states. The central government has no control over state boundaries. It will have no control over western lands. Its main purpose was a common defense. They will have no chief executive like a president or a king or a tyrant or anything like that. And there would be no national judiciary. Okay? Essentially what they had created was a group of men who would serve as the administrators for the war. As the administrators for the war. Okay? The structure looks just like the Continental Congress. Delegates from each state, from 2 to 7 delegates, would arrive. Okay? They'd be selected annually by the state legislatures, but no delegate could serve more than 3 years out of 6. Each state only gets 1 vote. So even though you send 7 delegates, your 7 delegates have to vote together to determine yes or no vote. Okay? Most things require, I put there simple majority, but it's a simple absolute majority. Okay? 7 yes votes out of the 13 possible is how things worked. For big things, declaring war and things like that, and negotiating treaties, you would need 9 yes votes out of the possible 13. And to approve or amend the articles, you need unanimous consent of all 13 delegations, plus all 13 state legislatures have to agree to the amendments to the Articles of Confederation. This will later prove to be a problem because this whole notion of 7 yes votes for simple business to take place, if only 7 delegations show up, if everybody doesn't vote yes, then nothing passes. Question of how we're going to fund the war, the government. We need to finance the war. Each state will contribute to a common treasury based on the state's land value. How much land the states claim to own. Okay? Taxes are actually levied by the state legislatures. The Continental Congress tells each state what their fair share is, and then each state legislature, the elected representatives, will tax the people of their states by direct representation. And so that satisfies that ideal of direct representation. However, there's no way to force a fair share. During the war, that was fine, because it was self-preservation that kept them going. However, when the war is over, there's no longer a need for self-preservation. But this is what they wanted. They didn't want an all-powerful central government. They wanted a league of states with a rotating personnel, nobody who stays in power very long. They didn't want a chief executive, no king, president, tyrant. They didn't want this group to have the ability to tax them. They wanted, it required unanimous consent to change this document. Okay? It's what they wanted. They don't want it to be able to be changed easily. They want it. And what happens, it turns out to be a very, very static document. Okay? So, we are going to stop there for the moment, and then we are going to start the second video with the problems with the Articles of Confederation and the creation of the Constitution.